Donkey Kong. A classic video game, and arguably one of the most influential video games of all time. It was developed and published by Nintendo, and introduced two of their long-running characters, Donkey Kong, of course, as well as their own mascot, Mario, who is the protagonist, on a quest to save his then-girlfriend Pauline from Donkey Kong, who kidnapped her. He must do this by jumping over barrels. Because, look, it's an arcade game. It was fun. It was a fun game, and it did really, really well. It was actually created to salvage unsold arcade cabinets after the failure of another game Nintendo made called Radar Scope, and it was intended for Nintendo of America's audience. The project was assigned by Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, to the then brand new to the industry, Shigeru Miyamoto. Now, Miyamoto is actually now one of the most famous video game designers of all time, and indeed, he would prove himself with Donkey Kong. The game became a rousing success, becoming the highest-grossing game of both 1981 and 1982, and was ported to a bunch of home systems, a trend that continues to this day, in fact. Even if you're not super familiar with video games, you've probably at least seen Donkey Kong before. But how does this relate to a lawsuit? And why was the lawsuit, well, stupid? Well, to begin with, this is America, and we have a lot of stupid lawsuits in this country. I don't think anyone would deny that. But in this case, it involved Nintendo and Universal Pictures. Now, Universal Pictures probably also doesn't need any introduction. After all, they've been responsible for some classic films, such as Jurassic Park and Jaws, just to name a few. Of course, they also had to work with the legendary Spielberg to accomplish that, but the point is Universal has made a lot of money for themselves. And indeed, in 1982, they took issue with Donkey Kong, because, I mean, obviously there's some influence here when it comes to King Kong. King Kong is, of course, another classic film, arguably one of the best films ever made. It spawned several remakes, sequels, and more recently, he's been teaming up with Godzilla. So, you know, most of us also know what King Kong is. And Universal felt that Donkey Kong was far too close to King Kong for it not to be a trademark infringement. Sid Sheinberg, who at the time was the president of MCA and Universal City Studios, was looking into getting Universal involved in the, at that point, booming video game market. This is, of course, a year before the market would crash, but no one knew that then. In April of '82, he learned about Donkey Kong, as well as the success of the game, and decided to send Robert Hadel, who was the vice president of legislative matters, to investigate this because he heard the word Kong, and thought, wait, like King Kong? Hadel felt that Donkey Kong's storyline was clearly based on King Kong, and therefore was an infringement on Universal's rights to that film's characters and scenario. Sheinberg would also realize that Nintendo had several licensing agreements with other respective companies regarding Donkey Kong. Nintendo back then was just a video game maker, not a console developer necessarily. They had some hardware, but it wasn't like it is now. In particular, they had an agreement with Coleco, who were actually making stuff like the ColecoVision, to allow them to create their own version of Donkey Kong for the home market. Sheinberg would schedule a meeting with Coleco's president, Arnold Greenberg, on April 27th. And Greenberg was under the impression that this was all in good faith. He thought the meeting was to discuss a possible investment in Coleco from Universal, which could have been quite lucrative for them. Instead, Universal simply lambasted the poor guy for copyright infringement and threatened to sue them if their console, the ColecoVision, shipped with Donkey Kong as was intended. Greenberg wasn't really fond of this entire exchange. Plus, if he didn't ship his console with Donkey Kong, that would be a massive blow. Donkey Kong was very popular. People wanted to play a home version, and the Atari 2600 was still fairly dominant. If Coleco wanted to make a dent in the market, they had to have a pretty good game to go along with the console. Donkey Kong was it. He couldn't just give that up. The day after the meeting, Universal sent a message, or rather a threat, to both Coleco and Nintendo. They were given 48 hours to cease marketing Donkey Kong, and to dispose of all Donkey Kong inventory, and to hand over all records of profits made from the game. Or else, obviously, this is ridiculous. Universal was clearly trying to bully both these companies. But Greenberg was strong in his stand, and on May 5th, he managed to reach an arrangement with Universal, agreeing to pay them royalties, 3%, of Donkey Kong's net sale price, even though Donkey Kong wasn't King Kong, but more on that later. This would amount to about 6 million units, worth about $4.6 million. This was enough for Universal to at least get off Coleco's back, so Greenberg didn't have to worry about them anymore. The respective companies signed an agreement that did state that Universal wouldn't sue Coleco as long as those royalties were paid. But Universal was not finished trying to push absolutely everybody around. Hadel would learn that Tiger Electronics had actually licensed King Kong for a handheld game, and he decided that Universal's earnings from it were actually too low, and that the license's granting of exclusive rights to Tiger would impede the agreement with Coleco, because as far as Universal was concerned, King Kong and Donkey Kong were one and the same. They couldn't say you both have exclusive rights because, well, they both can't have exclusive rights, right? On May 4th, Scheinberg sent Tiger a message demanding that they send their game in for further approval. Universal decided that King Kong was going to be too similar to Donkey Kong, so Scheinberg revoked the license. Tiger's president, O.R. Rissman, refused to give in because, frankly, it was ludicrous that they would pull the rug out from under them now, and actually directly challenged Universal's claim that they even owned the King Kong name at all. And I bet you're probably wondering, well, what's going on with Nintendo? Did they say anything? Oh yeah, they had a lot to say. Nintendo's attorney, as well as a future board member of theirs, named Howard Lincoln, at first thought it might be a better option not to fight Universal, but just settle with them for between $5 and $7 million or so. But Universal's actions pushed him a bit over the edge, and he decided, no, you know what, actually, we're not just going to let you do whatever you want. And he also reassured Nintendo that, in fact, in a way, this whole fiasco was kind of a good thing. It was a sign that the company, that had been relatively small up until that point, had actually made it big. If they were attracting the attention of a monster like Universal, it meant that they were making a substantial profit, that they were doing well. Well enough that Universal didn't feel inclined to just ignore them. On May 6th, a meeting occurred between Nintendo, Coleco, and Universal over in Los Angeles. Hadel simply reiterated his point that Donkey Kong clearly infringed on Universal's rights to King Kong. Lincoln, on the other hand, pushed back, and Nintendo had discovered a whole bunch of unlicensed uses of King Kong's name and characters, and that Universal's trademark on these was actually less than 10 years old. They weren't bothered by all the others. Why are you bothered by Donkey Kong so much? Outside of the meeting, Greenberg, head of Coleco again, remember, actually tried to persuade Nintendo to sign a licensing agreement, and he hadn't told them that he had personally already done so. He was looking out for his own company. He didn't want this whole thing to come crashing down and affect the Coleco vision, which could prove catastrophic for them. By the end of the whole thing, Hadel agreed to send a chain of title to Nintendo regarding Universal's ownership of the name, but they never actually did that. And when Lincoln asked about it, they simply responded with more demands for royalties. We're not gonna give you proof of anything, just give us money. No! Lincoln decided to do some more research and try to figure out if Universal even had any claims to King Kong. What he found, he deemed, not enforceable, like they really didn't have anything based on what he could tell. And Nintendo would then call for another meeting that happened on May 21st. Scheinberg took this as a sign that Nintendo was going to cave, and even said that they could expect future business from Universal if they only agreed to settle the matter. Lincoln simply told him, yeah, you don't have any legal basis, we're not giving you anything. Scheinberg was apparently shocked. With this, a court battle was inevitable. Hadel would reach out to the Tiger president Rissman to try to compromise their little disagreement on the handheld King Kong issue. Hadel wanted to remove the exclusivity provision of the license, and he pushed to distinguish the handheld game from Donkey Kong so as to weaken any potential counterclaims that the licensee had actually violated Nintendo's intellectual property rights, because Tiger's version of this game was pretty much just a carbon copy of Donkey Kong, interestingly enough. Rissman decided that this was reasonable, and Tiger responded by supplying the hero with a fireman's hat. They replaced the barrel graphics with bombs, and they made the game platform straight instead of crooked. That design would be approved in early June. It was still clearly a copy of Donkey Kong, but at least it was different enough that they might have a legal standing to say, yeah, it was inspired, sure, but it's not a direct copy. Plenty of games do that all the time, and get away with it. On June 29, 1982, Universal officially sued Nintendo for trademark infringement. They also announced that they agreed to license the rights to King Kong to Coleco. The court date was quite a few months off, and on January 3rd, 1983, Universal actually wound up sending cease and desist letters to all of Nintendo's licensees. Oh yeah, they went that far with it. They offered them all 3 options. Stop using Donkey Kong characters, obtain a license from Universal, or be sued. 6 of the licensees gave in, but Milton Bradley stood on business and told them to buzz off. Ralston Purina was originally going to cave and offered $5,000 for the use of Donkey Kong characters on breakfast cereal, but Universal said no, so Ralston Purina also said no. Lincoln did not handle the case himself. Instead, he hired a man named John Kirby to represent Nintendo in court. Now, Kirby's reputation preceded him. He had already won several very large cases, representing companies like Pepsi, General Foods, and Warner Lambert. So he had experience handling matters such as this, though he wasn't super familiar with video games necessarily. However, he jumped right in and researched the game's development, and took depositions from designer Shigeru Miyamoto, as well as Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Miyamoto did admit that initially, yeah, he did call the ape character King Kong, but he also explained that in Japan, the name King Kong is kind of slang for any large ape, and the final design didn't use that name at all. Sure, it still had Kong in it, but it was Donkey Kong. The case would be heard at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York by Judge Robert W. Sweet. The trial would last a week, and Universal argued that the name Donkey Kong would actually be confused with King Kong, because the public, they don't know any better. Donkey? Does that mean king? Oh my goodness, these are obviously the same thing. Goodness, we so stupid. We don't know nothing. And that the plot of the game was clearly an infringement on that of the film. I mean, of course you guys remember that classic scene from the original King Kong when Jack Driscoll has to jump over a bunch of barrels, smash him with a giant mallet, and then when he gets up to King Kong to rescue Anne, the ape just kind of gives up. Yeah, exactly like the movie. Absolutely. No question about it. I don't know how Nintendo thought they could possibly get away with this obvious carbon copy of the film, you know? Kirby, of course, managed to properly defend all of this, and he first showed key differences between King Kong and Donkey Kong. And by differences, I assume what he actually said was, well, the game and the movie both have a man, a woman, and a big monkey. And they have nothing else in common. But Kirby had another trick up his sleeve. You see, in his research, he discovered something very interesting about this case. And this is something I haven't actually mentioned this whole time, because while I do feel it is super relevant, I just think it's a lot better when you feel the way Universal did when this was dropped on them by Kirby. He would allege in court that, in fact, Universal didn't have any rights to the King Kong characters at all. Oh yeah, Universal had been running around for the last couple years, demanding royalties for King Kong, when in reality, they didn't own King Kong. Some of you may have already found this whole thing odd, given the original 1933 film was distributed by RKO Radio Pictures. They also hadn't actually made the 1976 remake. Paramount did. And for that, the producer, Dino De Laurentiis, had acquired the rights from RKO General. Universal wouldn't produce their own version of King Kong until 2005, but wait, how can all these different companies possibly be making King Kong at this point? Well, that's because during Universal's own legal battle with RKO over the whole fiasco, because they also wanted to make their own remake at the time, they proved in a court of law that, in fact, King Kong is in the public domain. They, themselves, proved this. And yet, they ran around demanding royalties for something that they themselves proved they didn't own. Universal didn't really have a retort to that, because, yeah, and Judge Sweet ruled that Universal didn't have any trademark on King Kong. And he reasoned that it was because King Kong didn't actually designate a single source, and even if King Kong was a Universal trademark, and it wasn't, the possibility that anyone could actually confuse Donkey Kong and King Kong was frankly absurd. In the judge's view, Donkey Kong was clearly a more comical ape character, meant to be cartoony and fun, whereas the King Kong character was a much more ferocious beast, adding a sense of danger, horror, and drama to the appeal. Like they had nothing in common beyond the fact they were both big apes. He went on to say that, at best, Donkey Kong was a parody of King Kong. And parodies are permitted under legal doctrine, so even if Universal could prove conclusively Donkey Kong was that, it wouldn't matter. But you're never gonna believe this. Despite clearly losing, just getting obliterated in court, by stepping on a landmine they themselves put down, Universal appealed. Yeah! They sent their appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. That part of the case was argued on May 23rd, 1984. And Universal decided this time they were going to push on the consumer confusion bit. They presented the results of a telephone survey of 150 managers and owners of arcades, bowling alleys, as well as pizza restaurants, because, of course, Donkey Kong was an arcade machine, and basically every place like that had Donkey Kong. It was very popular. They asked the question, to the best of your knowledge, was the Donkey Kong game made with the approval or under the authority of the people who produce the King Kong movies? Only 18% of those surveyed answered in the affirmative. A follow-up question was, as far as you know, who makes Donkey Kong? And no one said Universal. But they still somehow argued this was enough evidence to show that consumers were so confused. They just didn't understand about the distinction between the two names. Oh my goodness! They only have one word of a difference. It's so hard to tell them apart. They look exactly the same. They're both monkeys, you guys! They also provided 6 examples from print media of more cases of confusion between these characters. For example, in a 1982 issue of Video Gaming Illustrated, it was shown to read that our Donkey Kong presentation continues as we look at other gorillas who have a fondness for women. Prominent among them is King Kong, who has much in common with the video villain, which I don't think there's any confusion. They're simply acknowledging that, yeah, they have some similarities. Anyone can tell you they have similarities. It doesn't mean they're the same, you fools! The decision on the appeal was rendered on April 4th. The courts upheld the previous verdict because, seriously, guys, shut up! They would declare that the two properties have nothing in common but a gorilla, a captive woman, a male rescuer, as well as a building scenario. Also, did you guys just choose to ignore the part where the last judge told you you don't have the rights to this? The court also ruled that the Kong and King Kong names are actually widely used by the general public and are simply associated with apes, as well as other objects of enormous proportions. They're not distinct enough to actually trademark in the first place, even if Universal had one. And they don't. The court also was completely unconvinced by that survey, as not only did it really not establish much confusion, but it also only solicited opinions from people who already had the Donkey Kong game. The survey didn't establish any confusion from potential customers, which would be relevant at this point. And the survey was cleverly designed and asked an obvious leading question in that it suggested its own answer. The court did admit that there were probably a few consumers that may have gotten them mixed up, but the fact that there were a few confused consumers doesn't create a sufficiently disputed issue of fact regarding the likelihood of confusion so as to make summary judgment improper. Nintendo would actually file counterclaims on May 20th, 1985. Since this whole process had cost them quite a bit of money, and as we've already established quite conclusively this is absurd, Judge Sweet would rule that the cease and desist letters that Universal had sent Nintendo's licensees had actually shot themselves in the foot. Not only was it astonishingly toxic and brutish to do that, but it also gave Nintendo the right to seek damages, because they had directly interfered with Nintendo's own licensing process. Universal was ordered to pay Nintendo $1.8 million for legal fees, photocopying expenses, costs incurred creating graphs and charts, as well as lost revenues. Judge Sweet would also go on to throw Universal right on the barbecue saying that throughout this litigation, Universal knew, as a result of the RKO litigation, that it had no rights to any visual image of King Kong from the classic movie or its remake. Nonetheless, Universal, when it deemed beneficial, made sweeping assertions of rights, attempting to extract license agreements from companies incapable of or unwilling to confront Universal's profit center. In terms of further awards, Nintendo was given the option to either take Universal's own licensing profit that they had gotten illicitly, or accept statutory damages. Nintendo took the first choice, and received $56,689.41, on top of other damages and attorney's fees. And, hilariously, the suite would go on to rule that the game Tiger had made, based off of King Kong but was clearly a ripoff of Donkey Kong, was in fact a direct infringement of Donkey Kong. Even with the changes, it was clear what had happened here. Pretty much the only bone that Sweet threw Universal was that he did rule against Nintendo's claims to damages from Universal establishing licenses with Nintendo's licensees in the cases where those licensees also paid Nintendo. If they were paying both of them, then Nintendo wasn't actually out any money. But that did mean those licensees could turn right around and sue Universal themselves. And Coleco, for example, did, and Universal would have to pay them by buying stock in the company. Since both companies had somewhat been ruled against in this case, they both actually appealed, and the case was argued on June 16, 1986, but the verdict was still upheld. And that was the end of that. Donkey Kong is still a very famous character, he doesn't infringe on anybody, and Universal made themselves look like utter nincompoops. Nintendo was actually extremely grateful to John Kirby for his service, as he did a bang-up job on the case. On top of his payments as an attorney, they wound up gifting him a $30,000 sailboat, which they had christened Donkey Kong. They also gave him exclusive worldwide rights to further use that name for sailboats if he so chose. On top of this, you may say, wait, John Kirby. Is that? And yes, it's exactly what you're thinking. Nintendo's character, Kirby, with his own video game series, would be named after John. It's unclear how John Kirby might have felt about the fact that his namesake would be used on a pink ball, but also, everyone kind of loves Kirby, let's be fair, and it is rumored, at least, that a copy of the original game, Kirby's Dream Land, was sent to John, who was allegedly both humored and flattered by the gesture. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train fighters, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Price Drenton, Master of None, Travis Solinsky, Jared Russell, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben Nicola, Panzer Kitson 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Kurt Forkum, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Racer 78, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, DM Travel Typhoon, Harry, True Debris, George Kenny, Murder Drone Stall, Kevin Wood, Liam Wright, Morris Hillman Productions, NJ1969, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Western Colorado History, AET Museum, Ryan Wehofer, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.